My name is Wyatt Bott. I am the chairman of the Montana Libertarian Party. First, a little bit about the show. The title is a little bit confusing to some people. Libertarianism is kind of it's not exactly new, but a lot of its principles are different to what many people are used to in politics. And of course, as with all things that involve change, there's a lot of fear oriented towards it. So the name is kind of like playing up to that. That a lot of people fear libertarianism for nothing more than the fact that it's new and different. So we hope to overcome that. So we're kind of like making fun of it. Let me tell you a little bit about the Libertarian Party. For those of you who don't know, Libertarians are neither liberal nor conservative. They're kind of a combination of the two, but without being in the center. A good, easy way to explain it is that we take the economics of conservatives, the free market, and we take the personal freedom rights of the liberal philosophy.
Basically, through history, government has operated in one of three modes, and we've listed these three modes on one of our posters here under option number 1, option number 2, and option number 3. Could we focus on this first poster here? Option number 1, the minority governs the majority. And in fact, this is the mode that government has operated under throughout most of human history. Now, we weren't around when governments first started, but we do know that people first formed into organizations. They were clans or tribes. Very frequently, the leader of the tribe or the clan was the oldest and the wisest person in the tribe or clan. Also, just as frequently, it was the biggest, baddest bully in the clan. And sometimes the bully would get other bullies to help impose his rule on the members of the clan. Other variations of this theme throughout history, numerous centuries of monarchies, the idea that people inherited the right to govern. Sometimes the monarchs would justify their rule with something called the divine right of kings. This is the idea that I'm the boss because the big G wants it that way. If you have a problem, you take it up with him. In modern times, we've seen various other variations on this same theme all over the political spectrum: left-wing communist politburos, right-wing military juntas, all variations on this same idea of the minority governing the majority. Then at some point in human history, we evolved politically from option number 1 to option number 2. Option number 2, the majority governs the minority. This is a concept known as democracy. It was a great step forward. A lot of people gained a lot of freedom when we evolved from option number 1 to option number 2. But there's still some problems with option number 2. Even though it has secured a lot of freedom for a lot of people, it's not necessarily the best way to guarantee individual rights. Now, I know some of you will take issue with that notion. For those of you who do, please consider the following scenario. There are 10 people who are stranded on a deserted island. Now, they're stuck on this island and they're not going to get off anytime soon. They're off all the normal shipping lanes. They don't have any form of communication with the outside world. They don't have the resources or the skills necessary to build a ship large enough to take them off of this island. So they decide by a majority vote that they're going to establish a government to manage their affairs and allocate their resources while they're on this island. They decide by a majority vote that their government is going to be a democracy. Now, their very first official act is to pass an ordinance by a 9-to-1 majority vote. And I have to point out at this time that the composition of this group happens to be 9 men and 1 woman. They pass an ordinance for the preservation of the species, and it stipulates that any female has to submit sexually to any male on demand. My question to you is, does the 9-to-1 vote make it morally right, or is it still rape? If you think the 9-to-1 makes it morally right, well, then you're probably a Democrat. If you think it's still rape, then 5 minutes into this, you're already a potential libertarian. And that brings us to option number 3. Option number 3, individuals govern themselves so long as they don't initiate force or fraud against others or the property of others. This is a concept called self-government, and libertarians believe it's the concept the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote first the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution. Now, I have to call your attention to the second part of this phrase, the part about initiating force. That's very important. That's not something that was just added to make this a flowery, glowing phrase. It's something called the non-aggression principle, and it's the yardstick by which libertarians analyze issues and determine what our positions on issues shall be. Now, libertarians are practical people, but first and foremost, we're principled people. And you'll hear libertarians refer to the Libertarian Party as the party of principle. We analyze the issue based on this principle, and then and only then do we go back and look at the practical aspects, to look at practical ways to make this work. Now, keep this concept in mind about being opposed to the initiation of force, because we're going to come back to it in just a minute. But I want to ask a rhetorical question, and the question is, what is the proper role of government in a free society? Now, to answer that, we have to know exactly what it is we're talking about when we talk about government, and that's easy. Government, by definition, is the use of force. If you look in a dictionary, the dictionary will tell you that to govern means to control. Control, force, is implicit in the definition of control in government. Otherwise, it would be influence, not control. So even the good things that governments do somewhere, somehow, will involve the use of force. Understanding that, we can rephrase our question. Instead of asking, what's the legitimate role of government in a free society, we can ask, what's the legitimate use of force in a free society? And to explore that issue, bear with me while I enumerate three distinctive types of force. The first type is initial force. If you have any group of people, it doesn't matter if it's 2 dozen, or 2 billion, there's no use of force until somebody uses it first. Initial force is either aggression or coercion. The second type of force is defensive force. If I come into your home and threaten your property or your rights or your safety, I believe you have the right to defend yourself. Now, you may be a pacifist and you may choose not to exercise that right, but in any event, I believe that you have that right. And if you have the right to exercise defensive force, it should only stand to reason that you have the right to authorize others, such as those people who call themselves the government, to exercise defensive force in your behalf. Defensive force is nothing more or less than survival. The third type of force is retaliatory force. If I come into your home and I murder your parents or your children, you're probably going to want to see me punished. And I believe that you have the right to authorize government to punish me in your behalf. Retaliatory force is simply justice, or in some cases a deterrent, an extension of defensive force. Now, some people have suggested to me that there's a fourth category of force. They call it preemptive force. This is the notion of let's get them before they get us. I reject that as a category because every example of preemptive force I've been able to analyze, I've been able to, at least to my own satisfaction, to place it in one of the other three categories of force. Now, what does all of this mean for libertarians? Well, it's simple. The bottom line is that libertarians, by definition, are those people who oppose the initiation of force. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about people in government or people out of government. If I go out and commit an assault as an individual, I think most of us would agree that that is not a morally acceptable act. If I get a job for the government or get elected to a public office and commit the same act as an agent of the government, that doesn't change the morality of what I'm doing. If something is morally wrong for an individual, it has to be morally wrong for a government. As we pointed out in our example about the 10 people who were stranded on the deserted island. Government does not confer some mystical right on some people to violate the rights of other people. Now, in looking at the myriad of laws that government at all levels have imposed on us, we can apply this non-aggression principle and come up with a pretty good idea of what's a good law and what maybe is not such a good law. Good laws, from my point of view, would be laws that prohibit the initiation of force. These would include laws against murder, rape, robbery, fraud, trespass. These acts are all acts of aggression that involve the initiation of force. Other laws constitute an initiation of force, and because libertarians oppose the initiation of force, libertarians would be opposed to these laws.
When the legislature met in 1993, it first faced the worst crisis yet, because tax increases don't do really much for the economy. And so in an effort to deal with that deficit, they did not really meet the challenge of dealing with the spending problem. They mostly just increased taxes. What was also interesting about the session is not only did they increase taxes enormously and increase spending enormously, but they told us that they had actually cut spending. And the newspapers picked up the line that they had cut spending. When all the legislators got home, they discovered that Montanans had learned the truth, that in fact the legislature had given us the second largest package of tax increases in the country, and people were quite unhappy with them. So when the governor's sales tax proposal was voted on June 8th, 1993, it went down 3-1 for a variety of reasons, but probably the biggest single reason is that it represented a huge tax increase, even over and above the other tax increases the legislature had given us. And then when the backup tax was before the voters in the form of a petition campaign, the voters, 90,000 Montanans, signed a petition to put that backup income tax, House Bill 671, on the ballot. And in the next few days, we're going to be voting on whether to approve House Bill 671 or whether to reject the House Bill 671 tax hike.
Now, do you believe that there was some other way that the legislature could have accomplished that besides promoting the sales tax and a flat income tax increase?
Well, first let me say it's not a flat tax. It's one of the many deceptive things about the House Bill 671 tax increase is the claim that it's a flat tax. It's not. It's a single rate tax, but they apply the single rate to shifting definitions of taxable income. So they actually have a tax which is quite arbitrary and senseless. And they didn't just increase the income taxes, I might add. They also increased fuel taxes, so we now have the third highest level of gasoline tax in the United States. They increased the payroll tax, nearly tripled that. They increased a variety of other fees, which are disguised taxes, to the tune of about $21 million. Not all of them are disguised taxes, but a good share of them are. And so the question becomes, could they have done it in some other way? And the answer is clearly yes. We have learned over the last 4 or 5 years or so a great deal about how states can balance their budgets by reforming the expenditure side rather than increasing taxes. And that lesson for states, in turn, comes from about 15 years of experience that we've accumulated at the municipal level in the United States and also at all levels of government in foreign countries. So there were a variety of ways of balancing the budget without slashing services that they could have used for balancing the budget. I wrote about them at the time, others lobbied for them at the time, and we were simply ignored. There was just a contemptuous disregard for the will of the people of Montana that taxes not be increased, and of course the backlash occurred in the form of the petition drive and the very strong anti-tax sentiment that you see out there now.
I think that because of the strong anti-tax sentiment and other things that we probably aren't being represented as best we can. That's probably what promulgated all these other initiatives like 66 and 67, that we feel that the government is not representing us.
Well, in the last few years there's been a substantial amount of research done on how government works. We know now that institutions matter. The way we adjust government can make it more or less representative. You just can't set up a constitution where the voters elect a legislature and automatically assume it's going to work right. There are things that you can do to make the system work better. For example, the federal government is now considering the possibility of a balanced budget amendment because the current system of Congress, even though in some ways it served us well for the past 200 years, is not working optimally. And so what researchers have learned is quite often representatives don't really represent their constituencies very well. We see a number of indications of that in the state of Montana, a number of explanations as to why that's true. We know, for example, that about 33% of those people who sit within the Montana legislature receive state checks, either as employees or as the spouses of employees or as retirees. At the federal system, that's been unconstitutional from the very beginning, and to that extent, the federal system has served us well. Montana, unlike some states, continues to permit people who receive money directly from the state on a continuing basis to sit on the legislature and vote appropriations for their own agencies. So that's one way in which the system isn't working very well. There also are problems in the legislature involving lobbying. We have a substantial number of lobbyists. I think something like 40% of all the lobbyists that you see in Helena are paid for directly or indirectly with taxpayer dollars. So there's not a level playing field here. And Montana legislators, those Montana legislators who are responsible quite often complain that while they see the special interests all the time, they see the moneyed interests all the time, they don't see ordinary Montanans much, because ordinary Montanans are so busy making a living that they don't have time or energy to either do the research necessary to testify before the legislature or even drive to Helena to take the time to testify before the legislature. So the system that's been created is one that is not fully representative of all Montanans, and you see that again reflected in repeated tax increases, a continued resistance to reform in Montana, except in a few areas, and as you point out, the various initiatives that we see on the ballot now. Jim Getz, who was the lawyer who represented the Montana Education Association and a bunch of public sector unions, and a Helena landlord who rents the state agency named Alan Nicholson, those folks tried to eliminate the referendum procedure in Montana. They tried to destroy the referendum procedure as it applies to tax measures passed by the legislature. It's clear that they really knew in their heart that we weren't a minority, that we were the majority, or else they wouldn't have tried to destroy the referendum procedure. They didn't just go after the procedure whereby a measure is suspended or put on hold pending a vote. They are still in the process now of trying to convince the U.S. Supreme Court that it's somehow unconstitutional for Montanans to have the right to vote on tax measures. An extraordinary piece of arrogance on their part. Well, that's their line, but I will tell you, if we had presented a genuine flat tax, they would have been in there resisting it fiercely. The loopholes they're talking about are the right of people to deduct things like charitable contributions. Now let's look at what House Bill 671 does. House Bill 671 not only raises taxes substantially at a time when the budget is already in surplus, it also eliminates certain traditional deductions that Montanans have had. I'm not talking about loopholes. I'm talking first about the deduction for charitable contributions. Consider the impact on the University of Montana and the rest of the university system if we were to take away the deduction for contributions to educational institutions and to charities. You know, many people can only afford substantial contributions. Alumni, for example, can only afford substantial contributions to the university system because of the existence of that deduction. You take that away and you increase the reliance of the university system on the taxpayer. Similarly, similarly, we know that private charities tend to be, in general, more efficient in taking care of the needs of the poor and other social service needs than government is. I mean, this has been demonstrated in a number of studies. Well, what happens to the pressure on government if we defund the private charities by taking away the deduction for charitable contributions? Here's another example. Home mortgage interest. People struggle to buy that first home or that family home. When they consider whether they can afford the home, they take into account that home mortgage interest is deductible under the income tax return. Now, maybe it shouldn't have been that way originally, but that's the way it's always been, and people rely upon it. So along comes House Bill 671, this income tax hike, which not only takes away the deduction for people who already have mortgage interest or plan to have mortgage interest, but it takes it away retroactively, back to January 1, 1993. Somebody who bought a home in, say, May of '93, relying on the old law, suddenly is going to have the rug pulled out from him or her retroactively. I mean, can you imagine the mindset of a legislature that would take away deductions for charitable contributions, for contributions to the university system, for property taxes paid, and for mortgage interest, and do it retroactively back to months before the bill was ever signed? And that's what House Bill 671 does. You know, we talked to the Department of Revenue about it. If House Bill 671 is not rejected at the polls at November 8th, It will be retroactive to January 1, 1993. You heard that right. To January 1, 1993. There will be millions of dollars, probably somewhere in the vicinity of $60 million of retroactive taxes imposed on Montanans. And Montanans will have to pay to the Department of Revenue 9% interest on that money from April 15, 1994. Now, how could any responsible person, under those circumstances, at a time when we have a state budget surplus, vote to approve House Bill 671? It's incredible to even contemplate that anybody could vote for that measure. The point is, however, that increasingly charities rely upon the larger contributions, and so does the University of Montana system. For example, the University of Montana will benefit from a gift for, say, $5,000 from somebody, or they'll benefit from a gift from a retired couple that figures, well, we really don't need all this money, so what we'll do is we'll give the gift to the university system. Now, that is an increasingly important part of the university budget. If you then say to folks, hey, look, we're going to tax you on the share of the money that you didn't use for yourself. We're going to tax you on the money that you gave to the university system, as well as on the money that you used for your own purposes. Well, that takes the financial calculations and makes them somewhat different, doesn't it? And certain contributions that simply could not be afforded, some contributions that could be afforded under the old law could not be afforded under House Bill 671. And you know, well, I'm not just speculating about this. When House Bill 671 was passed in the late spring of 1993, and before it was suspended, statewide charitable contributions in Montana were down significantly. It was reported in the Great Falls Tribune at the time. Later on, after the law was suspended, my understanding is they went back up. So I'm not just talking speculation here. There is real-world evidence to indicate that that deduction does matter to people. But you know, the people it matters to more than those who contribute is it matters to the poor. It matters to the disadvantaged. It matters to students being educated. It matters to everybody who benefits, who gets essential services through educational institutions and charities. If anyone votes to approve House Bill 671, they're cutting those people off at the knees, because government is going to have to come in and do the job, and government doesn't do the job as well. Think of it this way: if you had $1,000 earmarked and you wanted to give it to the poor, would you give it to government? Would that be the most effective way? Or would you give it to your local charity that you know is helping the poor? I think almost everybody, even friends of government, would say if I had $1,000 to help the poor, I would give it to an efficient private charity. I wouldn't give it to government. If you vote for House Bill 671, that's what you're doing. You're taking this extra money and you're giving it to government instead of to private charity or to educational institutions.
The individual should have the right to own a gun. Owning a gun doesn't hurt anybody in itself. It's not a crime. No, it's not a violent crime, definitely. To go out and restrict the use of guns just because some people get hurt with them is, well, it's the wrong way to go for the solution.
The National Rifle Association told me on the phone this afternoon that the American Hunter and American Rifleman issues will be coming out within 8 or 10 days. The ratings for Montana's senatorial race, Senator Conrad Burns gets an A with an asterisk, meaning the highest rating that can be given, and he's also endorsed. Challenger Jack Mudd is a question mark. There will be a question mark after his name. I didn't get to clarify exactly how they determined the question mark, but typically that means, and I only mean this typically because I'm not certain what happened in that case, typically that means that the candidate will not correspond with the agency querying him and just refuses to talk to the NRA. That may not have happened, but that's probably what happened. The representative House race for the state of Montana, Representative Pat Williams gets an A minus. Challenger Cy Jamison gets an A. Representative Williams is also, as I understand it, endorsed.
Personally, I'm really uncomfortable with what's happened with the Brady bill. First of all, I think it's opened Pandora's box. Second of all, it's a mandate from the federal government. I believe it belongs at the local level or at the state level to make those kind of decisions. I don't think the federal government is necessary to make decisions for Montana in regards to situations such as this. We're entirely different than large metropolitan areas, especially in the eastern part of the United States or southern part of the United States that have significant crime problems. And to be honest with you, it's more or less many of the major big city law enforcement executives who have pushed to get things like the Brady bill through. But I'm really bothered when the government starts monkeying around with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mean, we've lived by that for hundreds of years, and now all of a sudden we're beginning again. We're opening the door. How far are they going to go? The first time they were only going to restrict so many weapons. Now the new crime bill came out and they restricted more. I think that tells us the story.
I am against the Brady bill, no ifs, ands, or buts. A lot of people, including the current sheriff, is skipping around the bush on that. I will not do that, and I'll say it to the world. I am against the crime bill, no ifs, ands, or buts.
Well, I came in a little bit late into the organization, but primarily it was a reaction by a number of folks to both the Brady bill and the crime bill, and basically early on a reaction to the Brady bill. They were just in general concerned that what they perceived to be the Second Amendment rights of the citizens of the country were under a serious assault by the federal government and the laws that the federal government was passing. And they simply formed this organization to encourage people to recognize that that was happening and to try to influence the outcome of what they perceive to be an erosion of the Second Amendment rights. How to get in contact with us? I'll give you the address. Start off with P.O. Box 5067, Missoula, Montana, 59806. That's Citizens to Preserve the Second Amendment. Phone number for one of the ladies who does our secretarial work is 258-6672. And she will be glad to tell you when any meeting were to take place beyond the dates that I've just described.
The Democrat and Republican parties don't stand for anything. I think everybody's kind of aware of that, but it's really a problem. And see, if the Democrats stood for socialism no matter what, then you know when you vote for a Democrat what you're getting. And then you say the Republicans would be anti-socialist. They're not really, but if they took that kind of stance most of the time, then you at least have some idea of what you're getting. Well, let me give you a good example. Bill Clinton has recently started talking about an idea of licensing all people who own guns. Okay, an idea which I find kind of scary. Where did this idea come from? From a Democrat? No. It came from Rudolph Giuliani, the Republican mayor-elect of New York City. It's a Republican. I mean, he's standing for increased gun control. I mean, where does that come from? I mean, it just makes me go crazy because, there's a article in this Liberty Today magazine that you'll get if you send for by Ron Paul, who's a former Republican congressman and who resigned and joined the Libertarian Party. And he's saying the Republican Party claims to be the party of freedom, but I mean, if you look at their record, it's just absolutely not the case, and they really don't have any credibility with that.
And I've been telling people about the Libertarian Party, which has been a blast because I talk to people and they say, "What is that?" And so I started going into it, and what it comes down to is that you should be able to do what you want to do.
Right.
You know. Now, if it's not hurting somebody else, okay, you should be able to do what you want to do. Now, most people, okay, are not out to hurt anyone else.
Exactly.
And they're certainly not out to hurt themselves. So, just telling people what's going on and showing people what everything is about, the education process, that's what I want to see happen over the next couple of months and